you go ahead. We'll do questions in a moment.
Okay, sounds good. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process of making the ask and how you set yourself up for success with your ask. The first thing is the research aspect of this, the putting together of the lists and really getting an idea of who your donors could be. So this is a confidential process that needs to be done usually and managed very precisely by members of your campaign. What you're going to want to do is start with a bit of research. So this is called prospect research, where you gather old lists. So we mentioned the last time that these lists are publicly available. You can get the list of donors from previous campaigns to a counselor that maybe you're running in their seat, and from their financial reporting, and then use that to help inform who your potential donors could be. Another way to get at that information of who is the right prospect for your campaign would be through exploratory conversations. So talking to 5 to 10 people on your team, sitting down with them and almost interviewing them to talk about who they know in the community. So you're going to want to first target people that you know are known and know a lot of people. And you're going to want to ask them particularly, who do you think that you know might be willing to support my campaign financially? So you want to have that conversation somewhere where it's quiet, where you can have some confidential time with that individual, where you can earn their trust and explore that conversation fully, because it can be a bit of a difficult conversation to have sometimes. When I do an exploratory conversation with somebody, I usually book about an hour and a half to do that. And what I tend to do is I bring those old lists that I have as well. And I bring even some fundraising data from organizations like the United Way or other organizations in my community. And while I'm sitting with that individual, especially if there's a lull in the conversation and they're not able to provide me with a lot of names, I bring the copy of the list with me and ask them to review it as well. So that what we can do is talk about who on the list, from the old lists that we have, from other donor lists from organizations, who do they know that's supportive of the same goals as I might be, so that I might be able to make that call. The other thing that we do in the research stage is we have to determine who on the team is willing to make that ask. Not only willingness, but also the relationship. So for instance, if I'm the fundraising chair for a campaign, I'm 100% willing to make that call for that campaign. But the question is, am I the right person every time? And the answer usually is I'm not. Usually the person that needs to make that ask is the person that has the best relationship with the person that we're trying to ask for money. So what that typically looks like in a list is that you've put together this Excel spreadsheet and you've assigned somebody from the team to each of the prospects. And as we're going through this idea of what information you need to capture on this prospect list, one of the things I want you to think about is how much would you ask that individual for? So sometimes what happens is we want to just assume that we're going to ask everybody for the max amount, which we know won't have value. In fundraising, it's always better to ask for the amount that you think that you would get confidently. So for instance, I know that if I ask somebody for $1,200 when their capacity to give is actually around $200, they might feel that a gift of $200 is too small of an amount for that campaign. So targeting the ask amount to the individual is really, it's a good practice, but it's also an essential component when you're asking for a bigger gift. So sometimes what I do is if I'm working with a campaign and I'm working with individuals having these exploratory conversations and they're new to fundraising, And let's say I tell them what the limits are, and I say, you know, you can't, from an individual, you can't get more than $1,200 in Ontario. That's where we are. So what I say to them is, I want you to think about that prospect, that person that we're talking about, and I want you to think about their giving potential if there was no limits. So if this person was maybe donating to another organization, would that organization consider asking them for $1 million? And if that's the case, then my asking them for $1,000 has a different feel to it than if, and it's a psychological thing, than if I asked them for $1,200 and I thought that that would, you know, might not be as easy for them to do. So I want you to think about it from that perspective, that, you know, when you're making an ask, think about what that person's capacity is outside of the donation limits as well. And then I also want you to think about their capacity based on their connectivity to your campaign. So you may have people that are very entrenched in your campaign and really believe in your message, and they would give every amount they possibly could to you, right? So they would give you the full $1,200, but perhaps they're not a millionaire. So you need to really assess, based on what you know of the individual, what you think they could give. Any questions about that so far?
Corrine, I think this is a good moment just to pause and, as you said, take some questions. And so we have two questions that we'll go through. One is, and I think we'll take the first one, what do you mean by individual gifts?
Yeah. So an individual gift would be a gift from, let's say, one person to your campaign. And we qualify the individual gift around the idea that a donation is supposed to come from one individual. It's the name that we put on the receipt, and that the individual cannot give more than the 1,200 limit, let's say here in Ontario. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about an individual. So I know for some people that might be confusing, because when you think of philanthropy, you think of families. Sometimes you think about, oh, you know, certain families giving an amount of money. So you want to break this out by individuals. And I'll give you the reason why that's important as well, is you want to solicit a gift from each member of that family, or you want to be prepared to ask them to make gifts from each individual member of that family. So I've worked on campaigns where I've, you know, worked with individuals, part of a family, that have each made a gift at the maximum amount.
Okay. So Corrine, I'm just going to address a couple of these. So Alfie, to your question around old lists, so what's that's referring to? It would be referring to either lists that members of your campaign team or you have from past fundraising efforts. So it doesn't necessarily need to be an election campaign. It could be an election campaign from past campaign, but if you've done community fundraising, or if you have lists, it doesn't have to even be a fundraising list. It could be lists of folks that you think would be supportive. So it could be, say, even your address book is a list at the end of the day, and looking through that address book for people that you think you could go and make an ask of some sort to. And so that's one source. Other source of lists, you certainly can ask other people who are not already part of your team, but who you approach to ask them to support your campaign. And one of the ways they could support is by helping you think through your prospect list. Another source is that donations to campaigns are publicly available over a certain dollar amount. So you could go and take a look at contributors to campaigns broadly in your ward or in other wards, and you could identify either the types of people that are giving, or types of organizations, what the source of funds for other candidates has been, as a way of going to similar types of organizations or individuals. Or you could actually, especially if they're local, and say a candidate is not running again who has, say, similar policy positions as your campaign, you could actually go to maybe reach out to those individuals to ask them to support you this time around. So those are just some ideas around gathering old lists. And then in terms of can he buy a couch in the office less than 1,200? I think that's probably that would be out of scope in terms of interpretation of the election laws and whatnot. Getting to the finance rules, we're gonna. I think we need to stay focused on the fundraising in terms of what you can spend money on and whatnot, and who you're referring to, whether he is the candidate or whatnot. I think that would probably be something we could address either at the end if we have time, or if there are specific questions, maybe better suited either directly for the city or for somebody who's helping you interpret the Elections Act there. So the other piece, there was another question, which was around the new fundraising rules, or the new, not just fundraising, but new Municipal Elections Act that's being implemented. Would you be allowed to take a donation from an individual and then give them sort of profile at your event, almost like a sponsor? And again, I think we need to give the caveat that you need to make your own call. However, on these kinds of interpretations of the election laws, and that we're focused specifically on this about sort of asking and bringing in money, rather than sort of a compliance workshop, which would be different. But in general, I guess 2 comments, and Corrine, please feel free to add to these if you'd like. But firstly, there's certainly no problem in giving a company or an individual credit for providing, say, a venue if they do that in kind, or even if they do it in terms of if they're giving in kind support, you're going to have to count that towards your as a campaign expense and recognize that, of course. But you can certainly give credit to people for that support. Just as a note, you might want to be careful about having any type of like perceived sponsorship of your campaign. That's more of a reputation issue. You certainly do not want to come across as being funded by a particular interest. That will be unlikely to go over well with potential voters. So Corrine, if you want to add to that, but otherwise I think that covers the questions that were posted.
Sorry, took a minute to unmute. Yep, that sounds great. Thank you. So we talked a little bit about that gift amount. I want you to again think about how you're going to record this information. So if you're going to use a spreadsheet, again, you want to ensure that you're being very respectful of the information that's provided. In a campaign, you have to be very sensitive to how that information will be used during the campaign and then afterwards. So being very protective of that list. As we said, at the beginning, I said to go and look for old lists. Unfortunately, many campaigns are not protective of that list. And all that work can land in your opponent's hand the next time around. So just to keep that in mind as you move forward. So now that we've talked about how to put together that prospect list, now you've got your solid list of people that you're going to ask. You've assigned a target of how much you're going to ask them for. You've assigned somebody on your campaign team who is going to make that ask. So now I want to talk a little bit about the point people, or we could also think about them as event leads, perhaps if you're using less of a strategy around personal solicitation and you're using more of an event strategy. So I want to talk a little bit more about how you're going to go about making that ask. So one of the key pieces here is that a warm ask is easier than a cold. So what that means is if you have a connection at all with that person, if someone on your team has that connection, please try to use that connection in order to make that ask warmer, to warm that up, right? It will really help to put you at ease, but also to ensure that you are successful in that ask. One of the other things I find is sometimes we think that a face-to-face ask means individual to individual. It could be that the candidate and a fundraising volunteer go and make that ask together. I've done that with candidates, especially candidates that aren't comfortable making an ask themselves, which is something I encourage them to get over. But sometimes I say to them, why don't I come with you while you make the first 2 or 3 approaches, or I'll sit with you while you make a few phone calls first, just to get them comfortable with the process. So the different types of asks I want to go into a bit more detail about are the face-to-face ask, the phone ask, and then again with the events. So a face-to-face ask would be, the best person to make a face-to-face ask is the candidate themselves. So what you're trying to do with your prospect list is figure out who are those people that need to get FaceTime with the candidate to be able to be asked and brought on board with the campaign. So you might qualify that everyone that you identify on your list who has the capacity to give over $250, that those individuals should all be scheduled for some sort of face-to-face visit. So again, that can feel a little bit cold to just receive a call out of the blue from somebody, perhaps a campaign that you don't know or somebody that you don't know well, to ask to meet with a candidate. And you might think that maybe that first meeting isn't the time to ask for money. Maybe the first meeting for that individual may be that you need to just get them familiar with your candidate, get them familiar with the issues that they're interested in, and things like that. So what you'll want to do is think about how you position that. Is this a 2-meeting ask or is this a 1-meeting ask? So my perspective on this is you'll know when it's right. You'll know when it's the right time to make that ask, because it feels like you could basically say, insert ask here. So I'll give you an example of a face-to-face situation that I've been in with a candidate, where I had a candidate who wasn't very comfortable making the asks, and I made this offer to them to sit through a few with them. So the candidate and I kind of played off of each other, where the candidate talked about what they were passionate about, they talked about what issues they're really involved in, and why they think they should be elected this time around. And as they're having this conversation, the individual is showing a lot of agreement. The individual is saying how much they look forward to really working with this person. And then the individual we were meeting with said, how can I help? And so that how can I help became my lead to then ask them for their gift. So I want you to think about these kinds of scenarios that you might find yourself in a face-to-face ask, and think about the opportunity will present itself. It doesn't, it doesn't mean that it will always be that blatant, but at the same time, when the opportunity does find itself, you'll want to take that opportunity to phrase that question. So again, this is how I just saw somebody posted, how do you phrase the question? So how I typically phrase it is, I take a lead off of what they were saying before. So let's say in the case of how can I help? I might say to that individual, it would be tremendously helpful at this time if you would consider making a gift to the campaign of $1,200. And then I wait. Because when you're making a fundraising ask, the most important thing to do is to pose a question with a number and then pause. Because that pause then makes that individual have to fill that space. So they either have to respond with a, oh yes, I think $1,200, no problem, let me go get my checkbook. Or they might say, unfortunately I can't do $1,200, but I could do $500. So you have to leave room in that conversation for them to fill the air. Typically what happens is when we have a nervous candidate or we have a nervous person making the ask, they put the ask on the table, they put the question out there, but they keep talking. So they say, you know, I'd love it if you give me $1,200, but, you know, I understand if $1,200 is too much, and they start to talk themselves out of their own success. So make sure you take that moment after you've made the ask to allow them to fill that space. Now, one way to do it, if you are struggling with that idea of creating that space, is to drink a glass of water. So you ask them for the $1,200, so let's say, or whatever the amount is. Would you consider making an ask or making a gift of $500 to our campaign? And then you take a sip of water. And now you've paused and you've given them some room to fill that space, right? I would pause longer than that, just so you know, but I'm trying to be mindful of your time. Chris, is it a good time to stop for questions, or are we good?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I guess I'll just start off with one, and I think I love that that idea of the pause, and I've definitely seen that work well. What if somebody, if they balk, what are some of the things that if they look a little uncomfortable or whatnot, like how might how might you approach that if they are feeling uncomfortable or whatnot?
Yeah, so remember that people will play off your own uncomfortableness about the ask, right? So it's really important that you appear very confident, because you believe so strongly in this person that's running, if you're not the candidate, or you are this person and you believe so strongly that that approach of your positivity should help to address some of that uncomfortableness with perhaps that individual. Typically what happens is the response you will get is no to the amount, right? So then you start working through, if it's a no to that amount, is there an amount that makes sense for you? So
we should say often you get a yes to the amount too.
Yes, you yes, most of the time I can say I very rarely get a no to the amount. It's mostly a yes, and then what is the amount, right? So most of the time, especially when you're doing face-to-face asks, because these are people that have an established relationship, or you know them in some way or something like that, it's very warm, and it doesn't feel like a cold interaction. You can feel as you're going through this process, as you're trying to position this ask, if it's the right time, right? So if the person you're meeting with is telling you repeatedly no, then you know that your ask is probably going to end up as a no. So it's really about the warmth and reading each other throughout the conversation to know when the right time is, and to know whether or not the amount that you've got on the paper is the right amount.
And that's so true. And I think I'll just say that again, from my experience, the reason to go through this prospect process and to really assign point people and is to really increase the likelihood that you are going to get a yes. It's just a matter then of amounts, but it's people want to give. Especially if you've qualified them through this process of prospecting and you've got a point person, they're going to want to give. And in many ways, it's a really empowering thing to ask somebody to give, to be involved in a campaign like this. And so really it's about joining in, that you're and making sure that they're clear that as a donor, they're part of this. You know, they're making this happen. This wouldn't be possible without people like you giving, making this contribution.
Yeah. And again, I think you're gonna get that feeling as you're meeting with them. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about phone solicitation, and talk about.
We do have a couple questions, I think, too.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So we've got some questions coming in. How do you gauge the amount to ask? So I guess that would also be, I think, reading between the lines there, in advance of the meeting as well. So what are some of the the cues, maybe if you don't know a person's particular, past giving history or whatnot, maybe you just know something about them, like, oh, they're a business owner, or they're a principal of a school or something like that. You know that much, but you don't necessarily know their giving history. And then we'll start with that one, and then we'll move on to the next one.
So in the nonprofit world, we do it differently than in the political fundraising world. So in the nonprofit world, we have all this sophisticated equipment and research tools that we use for things like that to qualify a donor and figure out how much to ask them for. So for instance, we might come up with the name of a donor and then go check out the sunshine list to see how much they make to help us decide what kind of gift to ask. If you wanted to be that strategic in the way that you qualify your prospects, you absolutely could. But you could decide that there's just a threshold. That, for instance, if I saw their name on the list for donors to, let's say, a local hospital organization, and I know that they give between $500 to $1,000 to that hospital organization, then I know that positioning an ask to them in the $500 to $1,000 range for a political campaign is not out of range for them. So that's just an example. If I know that they've given in the past, no matter where they've given, I can ask around the same range. Any other questions?
If the person has said, let me think about it and get back to you, what should we do?
Yeah, that's a hard one because you can do one of two things. I'll tell you what most people do, and I'll tell you what's most successful. So typically that's a great stall tactic that people use, and it all depends on your follow-up and how well you go through that follow-up process as to whether or not you secure that gift. Because the majority of the time when somebody says they're going to give to you, it requires you to extensively follow up to actually get that gift. So what I can consider doing is creating a follow-up list from that. So typically if I have that person's contact information, or let's say I've got their email, following the meeting anyways, I would have sent them some sort of thank you letter for taking the time to meet with me or to meet with the candidate. And then I will outline a follow-up. So thank you for committing to make a gift to the campaign. We're thrilled to have your support. So acknowledge them as if they're a supporter already. And then from there, follow up on their gift. So if possible, phone again, or face-to-face is the best way to follow up. But if after that time you can't get them face-to-face or on the phone, then I would work through email.
Great, ready to move along.
Great. So I want to talk a little bit about the different phone solicitation types there are. So you can make an ask to a potential donor over the phone. It's better to do it face-to-face if you have the opportunity, but if phone is the only opportunity you have, then you want to start with some sort of welcome or initial call to welcome them to your campaign, tell them a little bit about you or about the candidate, and then ask them for an initial gift to the campaign. So with, one thing with phone solicitation is it's really changing right now. We're in a changing time for this type of phone call. And so what you need to think of is, one, that you need to make sure it's the right time for the individual when you're making the call. So check in and say, oh, is now a good time to talk? Perhaps as a way to start the conversation. See if there's another time you need to schedule that call with them so that you have their full attention. But really try to get them to give you a commitment of time as you have the conversation, as if it were a face-to-face meeting. So you're wanting them to take, 20 minutes or so to learn more about your campaign. And then at the end of that call, and really try to make it interactive. So a lot of these types of initial calls, what you'll do is you'll try to probe them about interests. So you'll want to talk to them about, I'm really interested and passionate about these causes, and that is why I've decided to run. I understand that you're very passionate about this, and pose questions to them So I know that you've been very supportive of the community in the past, and so I wanted to make sure that I gave you a call to talk to you about issues that concern you. Is there anything particular, any issue that you're currently very concerned with? And so try to engage them in a conversation. And then as the conversation moves along, at some point during that call, you're going to position it as an ask. And again, you're going to gauge if it makes sense to ask them on this call, or if this call is just to welcome them to the campaign and introduce yourself, and the next call or the next approach is about fundraising. So if it makes sense on this call, on the initial call, to ask them for a gift, you're going to want to give a specific amount and ask them to consider making a gift at that amount. And again, you would have qualified that in your prospect list. Another type of call that's different from the initial gift call is an upgrade call. So let's say you have a donor that went online and they made a gift to your campaign of $50. And let's say they did that May 1st or May 2nd, let's say. And now we're into, let's say, the middle of June, and you need to buy some more signs. And you're thinking to yourself, do I go to those people that have already given me $50 and ask them again to make a gift, or do I try to find new donors? Well, one approach is to do both. And that's part of that is the upgrade call. So to call people that have given you perhaps a smaller amount or within their limits, they've given you, let's say, outside of they're still within their fundraising limit, you ask them to make an extra gift. So that phone call typically happens in the nonprofit world, where people will get a call, maybe they're a monthly donor and there's a special campaign going on, and so they're asking for an additional gift. So I want you to think about how you might position that. So, you know, if there's some sort of urgent need for an advertisement is really needed to really help boost the candidate's name, or something else that you can make feel urgent, then it will help.
So Corrine, on that point, we actually, on campaigns in the last cycle, we actually went and said, hey, this campaign really wants to use digital tools to more effectively engage the community. There are costs associated with these, you know, and you could actually raise money to help pay for the campaign database or the, you know, like you said, advertising or whatnot. But we found that that was definitely an effective tactic.
Yep, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a great example. So you want to give them an opportunity, because they've already, you know, they've already said I'm in with their $50 gift, to now make a stretch gift, right? So that's an upgrade call. Similar to an upgrade call is a conversion call. So perhaps, let's say this individual attended an event. Let's say you had coffee parties and they attended a coffee party. Now you wanted to convert that coffee party attendee into a donor. So this is a conversion call. This is somebody that perhaps, you know, wasn't on your prospect list, but probably should have been, but somebody that you've interacted with, and now you want to help turn them into a donor. So it's just a slightly different script than your welcome script. You can also do a conversion call for somebody that's potentially an issue-based donor. So for instance, if you've, we're going to talk about this a little bit later about segmenting your lists and segmenting your prospects. But if, for instance, there's different issues that are very important to an individual, and you've solicited them previously on that issue, and now you have another issue that you're going to solicit on, and you're going to ask them to consider making a gift to that. So I'll give you an example. During the 2014 campaign, one of the hot topics was about a dam that we have here in London, and whether or not the candidates supported fixing the dam or not. And so it was a bit of a controversial issue, and the candidate was very keen on fixing the dam. And so they got a bunch of supporters, financial as well, that were interested in supporting the dam. So, you know, that was a very issue-based thing. Now, we went back to that supporter group on another issue, and ask them if they would consider a gift, again, because we were being out advertised to help with the campaign, and they had a good pickup from that as well. So, do we want to take any more questions, or should I move on to events?
I think we need to move on to events and then to the examples so that we can do, and I've prompted folks to let them know that we'd like to have a couple people, if they're willing, try out, or at least one person, try out and ask, and then we'll move along to tools for fundraising.
Sounds good. So for fundraising events, there's lots of different examples of fundraising events that are used during campaigns. So what I want you to think about is just, I'm going to throw out the example of these coffee parties that that we had for the mayor's campaign in 2014. And these were just, individuals opening up their homes and calling and inviting their friends and their neighbors and saying, I'm supporting this candidate and I'd like you to come out and have an opportunity to meet them. We did put into the invitation that there is an opportunity to support the candidate so that they understood that they may be positioned in that room to make a gift. It helps to, again, depending on the host, it depends on how you put that into that invitation. So for some of them, the host was very comfortable with their guest list, and they knew that if they said, bring your checkbooks, that those people would respond in a tongue-in-cheek way and be okay with it. Again, you have to know your audience. Sometimes just positioning it as there will be an opportunity to make a donation that evening if you shall choose is fine as well. So at these events, what would happen is the candidate would work the room, they would, and as well as the volunteers that were with the candidate, and then the candidate would give a speech, just a little bit about them and what they believe in and what's really important to them and their vision for the city, and then they would close with an ask. And they would do this to everyone that was there and everyone that was listening. And, they would talk about why it's important to support their campaign, and they would ask that the people in the room tonight would consider making a gift. And they would say, my fundraising lead is here with me tonight, and I would kind of wave my hand in the back of the room. And they say, if you're able to go and speak with her and contribute to the campaign, would be greatly appreciated. So that was just setting up the opportunity for an ask within an event, and it worked well. Other events you might have might be ticketed events. You might have, barbecues or other such things. I don't know if any of you have put any events in your fundraising plan, but I'd love to hear about them. Also, if you have any questions about the events you're looking to run, during the last campaign, we ran a few of those, we ran 50 of the coffee parties, but we ran a few of the smaller events, like a launch event, and then we ran an event, a larger event, just one called Change Fest, which was about 600 people that bought tickets to that event at $50 each. And we had a kind of a sub-campaign and committee that was just focused on that event alone. So I'm going to move on to an example of a phone script that you would use if you were making those phone calls that I was just speaking of. I wanted to give you this opportunity to go through the script, and then at the end of this example, if someone is willing to make that ask to try it out, we would love to have that back and forth and give you that opportunity. So this is how I would typically walk through a script like this. Hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm calling on behalf of this candidate. It says here, do you have time for a quick talk? I try to position it around how much time I actually need. So again, if it's going to take me a while to get that ask out, it might be a 10 to 15 minute conversation. So in this case, I'm thanking them for something first. So in this case, I'm saying, first of all, we want to give you a huge thank you for your gift or for volunteering or attending an event with us, whatever it might be that works in that line. It's awesome that you were doing this. And again, you can change the language around however you'd like. This one says, do you mind my asking what was it that led you to make a donation in the first place? So this is if I'm using this call to thank them for their donation and then try to engage them for another gift, right? But you could say, you know, I wanted to inquire how you came to know the candidate, or what you thought of the candidate from the event you attended. So again, you're trying to get some feedback from them to create an opportunity for dialogue. So this one again was positioned from a nonprofit. So it says, you may remember reading about this project that you helped fund, but you can position this around the candidate again. So you may recall that the candidate is very supportive of this project. And thanks to people like yourself, we were able to have an impact on that. Or you can say something like, you know, thanks to your support, we were able to buy, you know, 1,000 lawn signs, not yours personally, but the community support. And with that, position the ask to them. So again, the ask would be positioned around this. What we are doing today is a phone campaign, so we can tackle the next expense for the campaign. We are asking people to increase their gifts, so this was a bump up call, right? Or to make another gift of $25 or $50 or $100, whatever number fits there. So that you can create an impact for more people or in the future. Again, this was a nonprofit ask. So again, so you can create, or we can create a bigger impact for this campaign. So again, you can position this because it's a phone script. You can do it as an actual amount if you know the individual and know capacity. If you don't, you could position this as a range. So some people will say, you know, if you can make a gift between $100 and $250. And you'll have to decide what those ranges are. And you'll want to, again, create that space after you've put the number or the range out there so that they can then fill that space with their answer. Any questions about the script, or shall we try and ask?
Let's try and ask. We don't have any takers yet, but I'm not going to give up quite yet. Is there anybody on the line that would like to try out making an ask of Corrine to donate $500 to their campaign? And you don't have to be running a campaign, of course, to do this. If you would like to, please just provide a comment in the chat. Okay, Corrine, we'll give people another minute or two to think about that, and then maybe we can move along to the email example.
Sure. So here's an email example that I wanted to show you from the 2014 campaign that I sent out. And so the message was specifically segmented to non-donors, so people that we had on our list that hadn't given. And what we wanted to say to them was that there are, you know, only 500 people in our community that are really contributing to making a difference in this city by donating to campaigns. So we had a huge list at this point of people that hadn't given, and we were trying to figure out a way to propel them to give. And we thought this might be a way to do that, is to talk about the fact that they could be part of that influencer group. So this is just a sample of what it looked like and the language that we used in this particular solicitation. The way that we positioned this was that it came directly from me as the fundraising director for the mayor's bid, for his bid to be mayor, sorry. And you'll see that there's a little box that kind of leaves it open with a link to make a gift. So from this particular ask, what we found, it was quite successful with our non-donor group. And what we found was that typically it was, I don't think we had any gifts over $500 from this, but it was typically smaller gifts that we got from this ask, but it did increase our number. So I can't remember exactly how much we raised off of it, but it was quite successful to our overall campaign.